On the 28th day of April in 1945, Hanna Reitsch climbed into an aircraft and flew out of Adolf Hitler's underground bunker in Berlin, becoming one of the very last individuals to see the Führer while he was still alive. She had managed to land her plane in the heart of a city that was actively collapsing all around her, skillfully dodging incoming Soviet artillery fire to deliver a message that by that point had already become completely meaningless. Now she was departing from that doomed place, carrying with her Hitler's final correspondence and the certain knowledge that Germany's war was irreversibly lost. Her family members had already reached safety in the American-controlled zone, far removed from the Soviet forces that she feared so deeply. They had successfully escaped from their home region of Silesia, traveling across hundreds of miles of complete chaos and disorder, finally arriving at the comparative safety offered by Austria. The nightmare of war was supposed to have reached its conclusion. However, just 5 days after Hanna's dramatic departure from the bunker, every single member of her family lay dead. These deaths did not result from enemy gunfire or attacks by Soviet military forces. The person responsible for killing them was Hanna's own father, a well-respected medical doctor who had made the calculated decision that death itself was preferable to whatever uncertain fate might await them in the future. The specific method he chose reveals something far darker and more disturbing than simple panic or momentary fear. If you are currently watching videos of this nature, you will definitely want to subscribe to receive more detailed investigations into the hidden and lesser-known stories surrounding World War II families, the respectable, the righteous, and those caught in impossible circumstances, understanding who they were before everything fell apart. To fully comprehend what transpired on that terrible night in May of 1945, you must first understand exactly who these people were before the war tore absolutely everything apart and destroyed the world they had known. Dr. Wilhelm Reitsch, who everyone in his social circle called Willy, practiced as an ophthalmologist in the town of Hirschberg, located in the German region of Silesia. He was a professional man living and working in a professional community. He was not a fanatical party member or a political operative working for the regime. He was simply a doctor who treated his patients during the day and returned home to his family each evening. His wife, Emmy, came from an Austrian noble family background and maintained her devout Catholic faith throughout her entire life, even during the years of Nazi rule. Together, this couple raised 3 children in a household atmosphere characterized by education, strict discipline, and middle-class respectability. Their oldest child was Kurt, who would eventually pursue a career as a naval officer serving in the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy. Their youngest child was Heidi, who by the time 1945 arrived, had already married and was actively raising young children of her own. Standing in the middle of these siblings was Hanna, the daughter who would eventually achieve fame and recognition as the pilot who shattered aviation records and earned prestigious medals from the Nazi regime, and who ultimately flew her aircraft into Hitler's Berlin bunker during the final apocalyptic days of the Third Reich. The Reitsch family represented exactly the type of educated, connected, and resourceful German family that outside observers would have expected to survive the war's conclusion in better condition than most other families. They were not SS officers responsible for atrocities, nor were they concentration camp guards who had participated in genocide. They belonged to the German bourgeoisie, that professional middle class that maintained the country's basic functioning regardless of which political party controlled the government in Berlin. When the war finally ended, families possessing their background and resources were supposed to be the ones who would pick up the scattered pieces of society and begin the process of rebuilding civilization. That expected outcome is not what actually happened to the Reitsch family. The desperate flight westward. By January of 1945, the massive Red Army was grinding its way westward through the devastated landscape of Poland and pushing deeper into the German heartland itself. The region of Silesia, where the Reitsch family had lived their entire lives, lay positioned directly in the path of the advancing Soviet military forces. What followed this advance became one of the largest mass movements of civilian populations in all of recorded human history. Millions upon millions of German civilians abandoned their homes and fled westward during the brutal winter months of 1944 and 1945. They traveled by foot when no other option existed, by horse-drawn cart when they could acquire one, and by any motorized vehicle that still possessed enough fuel to operate. The roads leading west became completely clogged with desperate refugees, and the Soviet forces advancing from the east were never very far behind these fleeing columns of humanity. Terrible stories spread rapidly through the refugee columns, stories describing what happened to German civilians who failed to escape in time before the Soviet army arrived. Tales of mass rape, summary executions, and forced deportation to brutal labor camps located in the frozen expanses of Siberia. Whether these circulating stories contained exaggerations or represented accurate accounts of what was actually occurring, the refugees believed them completely, and that belief alone proved sufficient to keep these exhausted people moving forward through snow and ice, abandoning absolutely everything they had spent their lives building and accumulating. The Reitsch family joined this massive exodus of fleeing civilians. Dr. Willi, his wife Emmy, their daughter Heidi, and Heidi's 3 young children, Hans, Jürgen, and little Bern, all of them under 10 years of age, undertook the long journey westward. They traveled hundreds of miles through a country that was actively collapsing around them, moving past villages that had been burned to the ground and abandoned military equipment left scattered along the roadsides, moving past the bodies of those refugees who hadn't possessed the strength or fortune to complete their journey. Eventually, the Reitsch family reached the Salzburg region, located in Austria, deep within what would soon become the American occupation zone. By every reasonable and rational measure, they had successfully escaped the danger they feared most. The Soviet forces would never be able to reach them in this location. The family had survived what should have been the most dangerous phase of the entire war's conclusion. However, the psychological terror and fear that had driven them westward followed them into their place of supposed refuge. And this lingering fear would ultimately prove more deadly and destructive than any actual Soviet soldier could have been. The deadly rumor that destroyed everything. During the chaotic months of April and May in 1945, reliable information became virtually impossible to obtain or verify. Unconfirmed rumors spread through the overcrowded refugee camps with the speed and intensity of fire consuming dry grass. Some of these rumors contained genuine truth, some represented exaggerated versions of real events, and some were completely fabricated stories with no basis whatsoever in reality. However, in the complete absence of official news sources or trustworthy information, rumors and hearsay were the only things that desperate refugees had to guide their understanding of the world around them. One particular rumor began circulating extensively among the Silesian refugees who had fled to the western zones. According to this rumor, the American occupation authorities were planning to forcibly repatriate all Silesian refugees, sending them back eastward directly into Soviet hands. The story claimed that the Western Allies had made secret agreements with Stalin. According to these supposed agreements, Silesia would become Polish territory under Soviet control, and the refugees who had fled from that region would be gathered up and sent back, essentially being delivered directly to the very enemy forces they had spent months desperately trying to escape. Historical records cannot definitively confirm whether this rumor contained any substantial truth. Forced repatriation certainly did occur in some documented cases during this period. Soviet prisoners of war and Soviet citizens found in Western zones were sometimes handed over to Soviet authorities, despite their desperate protests and pleas to remain in the West. However, the wholesale deportation of ordinary German civilians from the American occupation zone back to Soviet-controlled territory remains a matter where the historical record provides no clear answer. What remains absolutely certain and historically verified is this: Dr. Wilhelm Reitsch believed this rumor completely and without reservation. For a man who had spent the previous months absorbing and internalizing horrifying stories about Soviet occupation, the mass rapes that occurred in East Prussia, the summary executions, the cattle cars packed with prisoners being transported to Siberian labor camps, mere belief in the rumor's truth proved sufficient to drive him to action. He had successfully brought his family hundreds of miles westward to what should have been safety. Now, he had become utterly convinced that this apparent safety was nothing more than a cruel illusion. In his mind, the Americans would inevitably hand his family over to Soviet control. The Soviets would then do what Soviet forces did to German civilians. Everything he had sacrificed, every hardship he had endured to protect his wife, his daughter, and his innocent grandchildren would ultimately amount to absolutely nothing. On the night of May 1945, 3 full days after Adolf Hitler had shot himself to death in his Berlin bunker, and 5 days before Germany's official surrender would be signed, Dr. Wilhelm Reitsch made a decision that would destroy his family forever and leave only death in its wake. A father's final and terrible act. The exact sequence of events that unfolded during that night remains somewhat unclear and uncertain, pieced together years later from official investigations and the physical evidence that was discovered at the scene. However, the broad outline of what occurred is absolutely horrifying in its calculated deliberateness and methodical execution. Some historical accounts suggest that Dr. Reitsch first attempted to use poison to kill his family members. When this method proved uncertain, when the poison failed to work quickly enough or completely enough to achieve his intended purpose, he moved forward to employ a more direct and immediate method of killing, moving room by room through the refugee lodging where his family had been staying. Dr. Reitsch carried a pistol in his hand. He shot his wife Emmy, he shot his daughter Heidi, then he turned the weapon on the children, Hans, Jürgen, and little Bern. 3 innocent grandchildren, none of them older than 10 years, were killed by the very man who was supposed to protect them from exactly this type of violence and harm. Finally, Dr. Reitsch turned the gun on himself. 6 bodies were left behind in a refugee lodging located in the American zone, the zone that was supposed to represent safety. These people were killed not by enemy soldiers, not by bombs falling from the sky or artillery shells exploding nearby, but by a 70-year-old ophthalmologist who had convinced himself that death represented the only form of protection he could still offer to his loved ones. The war was effectively finished. Germany had been completely defeated. The killing that had consumed Europe for 6 years was supposed to finally stop. Instead, Dr. Wilhelm Reitsch became one of its final perpetrators, adding 6 more bodies to a death toll that already numbered in the millions. These murders occurred in what should have been a place of sanctuary and safety. The American occupation zone represented the destination that refugees fled toward, not a place they needed to escape from. Thousands of other families, in circumstances identical to the Reitsch's, survived those same difficult weeks and eventually went on to rebuild their lives in post-war Germany. The Reitsch's family could have been numbered among these survivors. Instead, they became merely a footnote to the Nazi regime's final collapse. They became just another family consumed by the death for dishonor mentality that the Nazi ideology had promoted for 12 years, a mentality that had already claimed millions of lives across Europe. The pilot held in American custody while her family members were dying in Austria. Hanna Reitsch found herself held in American military custody in Bavaria. She had been captured shortly after completing her dramatic flight out of Berlin. Now she was being subjected to extensive interrogation about conditions in the bunker, about Hitler's final hours alive, about the conversations she had personally witnessed, and about the regime's desperate final acts during its last days. The American intelligence officers found Hanna to be an exceptionally useful source of information. She had been physically present for events that almost no one else had survived to describe. She had spoken directly with Hitler himself, with Joseph Goebbels, and with Magda Goebbels and her 6 children, who would very soon be murdered by their own mother in the bunker. Hanna had carried personal letters out of that underground tomb. She was quite literally a direct witness to history's final chapter in Nazi Germany. At some point during the course of this interrogation process, American officers informed Hanna of the devastating news. Her parents were dead. Her sister Heidi was dead. Her young nieces and nephew were dead. All of them had been killed, not by the Soviet forces she feared so intensely, not by the advancing armies that had driven them from their home, but by her own father. Historical sources describe Hanna's reaction to this news as utterly devastated. One official report specifically noted her state of misery. The famous pilot, the recipient of the Iron Cross Medal, the woman who had shaken Adolf Hitler's hand in the bunker just days before his suicide, was reduced to overwhelming grief by news arriving from what was supposed to be the safe American zone. However, here is the bitter and painful irony that elevates this story beyond being merely another tragic wartime tale. Hanna Reitsch had desperately wanted to die in that Berlin bunker. She had actually begged Hitler's staff to allow her to remain there when the order came for her to leave. She would later describe being forced to depart as, quote, the blackest day of her life, not the day when she learned her family had been murdered, but rather the day when she was denied her desired opportunity to die alongside Hitler. Hanna had looked at the collapsing Reich and seen honor and glory in sharing its final destruction. She survived against her own explicit wishes and desires. Meanwhile, her family members died specifically because they wanted to continue living. The fanatical survivor. This represents the central tension and contradiction that makes the Reitsch family story so profoundly difficult to emotionally process and understand. The most dangerous Nazi sympathizer among all of them, the family member who flew experimental test missions for Hitler, who visited the bunker during its final days, and who remained defiantly loyal to National Socialist ideology until the day she died, is the only sibling who actually survived the war. Hanna Reitsch was a genuine true believer in Nazi ideology. She was not a reluctant participant, swept up in circumstances beyond her control, and she was not someone who simply went along with the regime to avoid trouble. She was a devoted and enthusiastic adherent of the Nazi cause. She wore her Iron Cross medal with visible pride for the remaining decades of her life. She actively defended Hitler in interviews given many decades after his death. She personally embodied the fanaticism and ideological commitment that had driven Germany toward total destruction. In contrast, her mother Emmy was a devout Catholic woman who had absolutely nothing to do with the regime's documented crimes. Her sister Heidi was focused on raising her young children, concerned with family matters rather than politics. The grandchildren, Hans, Jürgen, and little Bern, were completely innocent by any possible definition. None of these family members had flown aircraft for Hitler. None of them had received medals directly from Nazi leadership. None of them had begged for the opportunity to share in the regime's final apocalyptic destruction. Yet, these were the family members who died. And Hanna, who had actively desired death, who had deliberately sought it out, who had romanticized dying for the Nazi cause, lived for another 34 years after the war ended. The question that this story forces observers to confront is deeply uncomfortable. Was Dr. Reitsch's terrible act genuinely motivated by his desire to protect his family from the Soviets, or did his actions represent the final expression of the same toxic ideology that his famous daughter Hanna so completely embodied? The Nazi cult promoted death before dishonor as a core value. The regime taught that surrender was infinitely worse than complete annihilation. The propaganda machine had drilled into the German population the conviction that a true German should never submit to enemy forces under any circumstances. These ideas had been systematically promoted for 12 full years of Nazi rule. Dr. Wilhelm Reitsch may have absorbed and internalized these ideological messages far more deeply than anyone around him realized at the time. He killed his family members because he believed he was saving them. That is undoubtedly the story he told himself as justification. However, the Soviet forces were never actually coming to harm them. The Americans were not planning to hand them over for deportation. The danger existed only in his mind, a mind that had been thoroughly shaped by years of relentless propaganda about the terrible fate awaiting Germans who fell into enemy hands. The brother that history barely mentions. There existed a third Reitsch sibling, and his story is defined almost entirely by silence and absence from the historical record. Kurt Reitsch, Hanna's older brother, served with the rank of frigate captain in the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. He survived the entire war without serious injury, while his parents and sister and nieces and nephew were dying in Austria. While Hanna was being interrogated about her experiences in the bunker, Kurt was somewhere within the collapsing naval infrastructure of the defeated Reich, simply waiting out the final conclusion, like thousands of other German officers whose war had ended. After Germany's surrender, Kurt settled in the city of Hamburg. He lived there quietly and without drawing public attention for 46 years, finally dying in 1991 at the age of 81. He left behind no memoirs describing his experiences or thoughts. He granted no interviews to historians or journalists. He made absolutely no public statements whatsoever about his famous sister, about his father's terrible act, or about what it meant to carry the Reitsch family name after May of 1945. What did Kurt actually think about Hanna's completely unrepentant Nazism? What were his private thoughts about the interviews where she continued defending Hitler decades after the war? What did he feel about the Iron Cross medal she wore when meeting President John F. Kennedy? We simply do not know. He never said anything publicly. Kurt represents the silent survivor, a man who chose to live out his remaining years without engaging in any way with the dark history that had utterly consumed his family. Perhaps his silence represented the only sane response available to him. Perhaps there was genuinely nothing he could have said that would have made any of what happened make sense or seem comprehensible to others or even to himself. The afterlife and career of a true believer, Hanna Reitsch spent approximately 15 to 18 months held in American military custody before finally being released. She had answered all their questions about conditions in the bunker, had provided her detailed personal account of Hitler's final days, and had served whatever intelligence-gathering purpose she could possibly serve for her captors. Then, the Americans simply let her go, and Hanna resumed living her life. She returned to flying gliders, the type of aircraft she had first fallen in love with as a young woman. She established new aviation records. She competed in international gliding competitions. Remarkably, she even became an aviation advisor to the government of Ghana, of all places, helping that African nation establish their national gliding program. The most famous female pilot in Nazi Germany was now teaching Africans how to fly. In 1961, Hanna visited the United States and actually met President John F. Kennedy at the White House. Photographs from that visit clearly show her wearing her Iron Cross medal, the very medal that Hitler had personally awarded her for test flying the dangerous V-1 flying bomb. Kennedy apparently found her charming and interesting. He either didn't know or didn't particularly care that she remained a completely unrepentant defender of the regime that his country had helped destroy. Throughout the post-war decades, Hanna regularly gave interviews in which she actively defended Hitler and his memory. She described him as kind, as gentle, as fundamentally misunderstood by history. She insisted that the Holocaust wasn't his personal fault, claiming that he had been surrounded by bad advisors and that he genuinely didn't know what horrific crimes were being committed in his name. This represented historical denial on a truly spectacular scale, but Hanna maintained these positions consistently until the very end of her life. Hanna Reitsch died on August 24, 1979, with the official cause of death listed as a heart attack. She was 67 years old. However, a letter she wrote to a personal friend shortly before her death has fueled decades of historical speculation and debate. "It began in the bunker," she wrote. "There it shall end." Some historians interpret this cryptic statement as evidence of suicide, suggesting it represents a final deliberate act connecting her death to the place where she had wanted to die 34 years earlier. Other historians see it simply as the characteristically dramatic language of a woman who had always been intensely theatrical about her Nazi convictions and her loyalty to Hitler. Hanna was buried in Salzburg, not far from the location where her family members had died 3 decades earlier. The pilot who escaped from the bunker was finally at rest near the people she had been unable to save. The questions that continue to haunt the Reitsch family story concludes with uncertainties and unanswered questions that may never be satisfactorily resolved. Genealogical records and some historical sources suggest that Heidi may have actually had more than 3 children, possibly including some who were not present with her on the night of May 3, 1945. Did any other Reitsch family members survive? We cannot say with complete certainty. The historical records contain conflicts and contradictions. The potential witnesses are all long dead, and the absolute chaos that characterized that period makes reliable documentation extremely difficult to locate or verify. What we can state with certainty is this: the Reitsch family line effectively ended in a refugee lodging located in the American zone during the first week of May 1945. The family was killed not by Soviet soldiers, not by Allied bombing raids, not by the massive violence that had consumed the European continent for 6 terrible years. They were killed by a rumor. They were killed by overwhelming fear. They were killed by a father who had convinced himself that committing murder represented an act of mercy and protection. The enemy forces never actually came to harm them. The danger was entirely imaginary, existing only in Dr. Reitsch's traumatized and propaganda-shaped mind. 6 human beings died because of what might possibly happen in an uncertain future, not because of what was actually happening in reality. And the one family member who was most closely aligned with the ideology that had created such paralyzing fear, Hanna Reitsch herself. She lived for another 3 decades after her family's death, continued defending Hitler until the end of her days, and died peacefully as an old woman in her bed. Sometimes history offers no clear moral lesson. Sometimes the story is simply what it is: brutal, deeply ironic, and ultimately unresolved. The Reitsch family gave the world one pilot who became internationally famous and one doctor who became a murderer. Both individuals believed they were doing the right thing at the time. Both were tragically and completely wrong. Thank you for watching this presentation from History Hangover. If you found this video insightful and thought-provoking, please check out our other detailed investigations into the families of the Third Reich and what ultimately became of them after the war ended. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next upload.